Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this online seminar of the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University, co-sponsored by our Illiberalism Studies Program. We are here today to discuss what seems to be a new emerging state ideology in Russia. And we will have really three great speakers with us to discuss several aspects of that. So what seems to be emerging now in Russia in the current context of the war is that several initiatives has been launched that seems to confirm new steps toward formalizing something that would look like a more rigid ideology for the regime and the population. We can see, of course, a kind of calcification of language and semantics in the official rhetorics and also in the media narratives. But we also have several initiatives related to launching new ideological classes for school, rewriting textbook, increasing military patriotic education, launching new university courses and kind of reforming the humanities and social sciences. And we also have noticed that fringe figures, especially those from the Budraitskis club, seems to be more and more closely connected to the presidential administration, which was not the case before. So there are like a series of things happening that trigger my especially interest for launching that discussion. And I can see by the number of people we have with us today that it's a question of interest for many of you. And we have three great speakers with us today. Let me present them very briefly. We have Iliya Budraitskis, who is a political and social theorist, previously based in Moscow, now based in Istanbul, who was teaching at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Science, at the Higher School of Economics and this Institute of Contemporary Art in Moscow. He had a book in 2017, Dissident Among Dissidents, which was awarded the Andrei Bieli Prize, and his more recent book, We All Live in the World Huntington Invented, was discussing modern Russian conservatism. Iliya has been also very active in the Moscow art milieu. Then we have with us Ivan Fomin, who received his PhD in political science for the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and who is now based in Washington, DC. Ivan has been working on the studies of illiberal and nationalist discourses in Russian and post-socialist politics, and is especially doing multimodal discourse analysis and social semiotics, and he will be talking with us today about what is happening at the school and university level. And last but not least, we have Mikhail Suslov, assistant professor of Russian history and politics at the University of Copenhagen, who has been publishing widely on everything we will be discussing today. His last book is called Geopolitical Imagination, Ideology and Utopia in Post-Soviet Russia. So welcome, everybody. I would like to give you, each of you, about 10 minutes for some remarks, and then we will take a question from the chat, and I will be moderating the discussion. So welcome once again, and Iliya, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much for organization of this meeting and for the invitation. So in fact, the recent news about the establishment of the full-scale ideological education in Russia raises again the question of the role of ideology in Russia. If we can talk about that some ideological indoctrination somehow leads Russia in, or was one of the reasons of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or vice versa, the need for the ideology came after this invasion happened already, somehow to fix it and to play a role in the transformation of the Russian society and Russian political regime. I think that the question of ideology in Russia very much related with the very notion of ideology. If we are talking about the ideology as the set of characteristics, set of ideas, or we are talking about the ideology as a kind of false consciousness, let's say, that express some kind of rational interests of the ruling elite, or we can talk about the ideology as the sort of material praxis that somehow express in the form of ideas in the secondary level. And I will say that probably we can talk about the Russian ideology in the third sense mostly. So on one side, we definitely can say that the Putin's elite are the people who were guided by some exact ideas. So it was very, very kind of distributed point of view that the Russian elite was cynical, that it had no any clear ideology, that it was guided by the pure private or group interests and so on. But I think that we can say that these people, I mean the people in the Russian ruling elite, adopted some kind of ideology which came not from the books, not from the intellectual tradition, but from their, let's say, material praxis. For example, if we look back to the Vladimir Putin's career, we can see that, well, during his early years in the Soviet KGB, he borrowed some kind of, let's say, conspiracy way of thinking from his experience of the Russian 90s in the semi-criminal atmosphere of St. Petersburg when he worked in the city government. He borrowed some kind of social Darwinist views of the world, coming exactly from his praxis. And of course, his position as the authoritarian leader for the last 20 years taught him some kind of historical mission of his own leadership and so on. We can also look at the experience of the whole generation of the Russian elite around Putin, and we can indicate that some kind of material ideology, this ideology of the let's say first level, came from their own experience. So that is a kind of mix of conspiracy theory, social Darwinism, the idea of the struggle for the, let's say, pure interests, for the domination, and power is the main real force that is driving the world, the global relations, and so on and so forth. But this kind of material experience always needed some kind of ideology of the secondary level, some kind of organization of this ideology in the terms of language, in the terms of some exact ideas, some images of the world, and so on and so forth. And we can say that during the past 2 decades, this kind of ideology of the secondary level that was somehow related to this material experience of the elite was created by a number of institutions It was created by the media. It was created by some exact figures, writers, and so on and so forth. So I think that we can indicate, let's say, four sources of this ideology of the secondary level. So I will briefly name them. So the first source is, of course, various conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking. The main idea, the main narrative behind the thinking is the conspiracy against Russia by some global elite, is the idea that Russia itself, as an existing country, is preventing the further, let's say, implementation of some secret plan of the domination of this hidden elite. And by the way, this was very correctly and very interestingly described in the recent book by Viktor Schnirelman, the great Russian anthropologist, where he summarized this conspiracy theories as the series of restraining force, Russia as restraining force, as a kind of katechon in the let's say Christian Orthodox language. Then the second source is, let's say, the set of ideas adopted by Dugin, Alexander Dugin, from the Western far right into the Russian political spectrum. So that are ideas more or less focused on the cultural pessimism, on the decline of the Western civilization, on the traditional values. So I think that this concept somehow very much related with this way of thinking. Then the third source, also in very general sense, is the historical revisionism. So we can name Vladimir Medinsky and many other authors in the field of so-called folk history that are trying to somehow reconceptualize the Russian history in the imperialist, nationalist, and also conspiracy thinking way. And the fourth source is the some kind of aggressive semi-realist school of the foreign relation thought, let's say. And I think that the bodies like Council on Foreign and Defense Policy of Sergei Karaganov and Fyodor Lukyanov play some important key role in this sense. So that are these four sources, but of course this could be developed, and of course we can find some more exact lines in this set of ideas. But what is the most important conclusion from it is that there is always a kind of interrelation in between this first and second level of ideologies. We can say that you have the rational interests of the elite on one side and a kind of fake ideological design on the other. So we can say that one thing is the basis and another is a kind of superstructure. So it's definitely a kind of interrelation and interdependence of these two levels.
Thank you so much, Ilya. I think that's a wonderful beginning, and the way you dissociate this kind of fundamental worldview or interpretation in the world and the more ideological or doctrinal construction and their equilibrium is a good way to try to answer the place of ideology in kind of pushing for events happening like the invasion or being the justification. So thank you so much. I will now give the floor to Ivan to continue on the more kind of concrete measures that have been taken by the Russian authority recently. Ivan.
Yes, thank you, Marlene. And thank you, Ilya, because actually I will be able to omit some of the things I wanted to start with because you already articulated them. So I'd like to share some of the insights that I think are important that I was able to develop when analyzing these recent innovations in how schools are used in Russia for ideological indoctrination in this new situation. But before I start with discussing some concrete things about what ideas are broadcasted through this emergent patriotic education in schools, I'd like to discuss a little bit why it is at all important to focus on schools and on younger generation. Well, actually, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to understanding what the Russian society, what Russian people actually think, and what are their sentiments and attitudes. But one of the most robust trends that we can observe is that the younger generation is more inclined to show less support to the regime, less support to the war, overall less support to the policies of the regime. So the Kremlin is quite aware of this, and we can see that these new elements in the schooling system, they are specifically aimed at resolving this issue. It is also an important task because actually this generation that is now coming of age is larger than the previous generation of young people. You can see this in the population pyramid of Russia, but actually you have to look at the data from about 2 years ago, because the data from the recent census is very distorted because the census was poorly organized. So we can see that there's this large generation, comparatively large generation, that is coming of age that the Kremlin is afraid to lose in terms of the support, and so we can see how they try to resolve this problem, how they try to broadcast some kind of ideology, some set of ideas that will be aimed at strengthening the legitimacy of the regime overall on the particular policies. So I will be mostly focusing on these new kind of lessons that were introduced in Russian schools recently that are called the conversations about important things, about things that matter. But actually it's a part of a larger trend because, for example, this summer there was this new kind of Soviet pioneer-like movement of school students organized that is actually Putin is the main supervisor of it. And another thing is that now there is a new legislation that introduces this position of patriotic upbringing counselors in all the schools and all the universities. And there's also some other elements of patriotic upbringing, for example, these weekly ceremonies of flag raising that are now supposed to be obligatory in all the schools. So, but let's take a look at these conversations about important things. So, first of all, it is interesting to take a look at how these this project was broadcasted. So actually, we can see that the presidential administration tries to use the capabilities of online education without actually turning it completely online. So we can see that they actually actively used YouTube lectures, but they made those YouTube lectures not for the students themselves, but actually those were weekly lectures for the school teachers. Like in summer, they were supposed to join these YouTube channels and follow some of the instructions of how in September they will be supposed to conduct those conversations about important things. And it is also interesting to see that the government tries to use this kind of the teachers' desire to put as little effort as possible into preparing to those classes, because everything's handed to the teachers. They have the lesson plans, they have the slides, they have the videos to show, so everything is transmitted in this centralized manner. And the key institution behind this process is the knowledge society, the Общество знания, that is this restored Soviet relic of propaganda and education. And so what can we see in these materials that were distributed among the students and among the teachers for the students? So first idea that is on which all these materials are focused is the idea of national unity. And in fact, the national unity is represented as a tradition of unity. So, and it is shown through a set of examples from history that the national unity is something important and useful, and that especially it is something that that appears as a unity consolidation around the leader in the situation of a war, like with the examples of Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Dmitry Pozharsky, Alexander I. So these moments of crisis or war in which the nation consolidates around the leader. So basically, it's an attempt to build a whole ideology around just a simple, rather around the flag effect. There's also an attempt to show that this disunity is dangerous, like the civil war after the revolution is shown like this example of how disunity leads to all kinds of danger. Or the collapse of the Soviet Union is shown like also the result of this lack of unity. So the second concept that is really emphasized in those school materials is the concept of self-sacrifice or heroism, with the strong element of military and in war situations, heroism and self-sacrifice, but also in some more civil versions of heroism, like for example, with these references to mother heroines, like these women who give birth to a lot of children. This is also shown like this. Also kind of heroism. And overall, the idea that was supposed to be transmitted to the school children is that it is dying for the motherland is one of the best things that can happen to you. Actually, it's your main purpose. And actually, this was the element that was eventually removed from this curricula, because actually, when it came to the actual lessons, there was too much tension and noise around this, and actually the whole curriculum kind of was watered down, and these elements were actually removed, or at least kind of made less explicit. Just one more thing to mention about heroes, that they try to construct this new pantheon of heroes that is supposed to include both the heroes like from the First World War, from the Second World War, and from the special military operation, just to build this line of heroes in which probably the school children are supposed to see themselves, to aspire to be in this line. So the third element, beyond heroism and beyond national unity, is I would call it solidarity. It appears in two aspects. One is solidarity, like in this aspect of social state and kind of social cohesion that is important for the for the nation internally, but it's also solidarity in this foreign policy aspect, like solidarity in a sense of mutually respective partnerships that are shown to be the alternative to this unipolar US dominated world. Russia is supposed to be not isolated from the world, but being built into this network of solidarity, network of mutually respective partnerships with other states. And finally, this element that appears in this curriculum is the concept of state authority, particularly when it comes to the proliferation of information. So the idea that is transmitted explicitly is the idea that in this information age, there are so many fake news, the information overload is very dangerous. So, and the recipe against this is just trust the official sources in all cases. So just the only credible source of information is the state, or in some cases also the church, and that's all. So and other sources of information are discredited. So I know, Marlene, how much time do you have? I'm afraid I'm
2-3 minutes more.
Oh, okay, perfect. So now let's talk about what is lacking here. What is lacking is a kind of more or less clear image of the future in this ideology. So here, if they do their job for them, if we put some extra interpretive pressure on these materials, we can see that what kind of looks like the image of the future is this multipolar world in the external aspect and the social state internally, but this is not said that consistently and explicitly. There are no kind of stable formulas for this. It's not something repeated, so not something that obvious. So this is something we can only reconstruct. And actually, they almost explicitly say this in these lectures for the teachers. And one of the lecturers explicitly says that there is this lack of big dream now, but it is shown like a global problem, not Russian problem. There's this lack of big dream, and the image of future Russia is yet to emerge. So this is something said quite explicitly. So they are unable to produce this image of the desired future. So, and this is the very weak point of the whole structure, because they're kind of calling people to die for something, but eventually they are unable to propose something to die for. What is the ultimate vision of the future that is worth dying for? Just a part of the same trend. Recently, we can see that the government seems to prepare something similar in the higher education, because we can see that they are preparing also it's kind of a special kind of special course for all the universities, in particular humanities and social sciences, that is supposed to be called foundations of the Russian stateness. And it is also supposed to broadcast some ideology, also how they call them, the axioms that are shared by the whole society. But actually, I've tried to reconstruct what they actually try to build there, and the things that emerged for now, they mostly look those people who are in charge of it just try to show that they're doing something, just to show it to their bosses, but it all looks very kind of intellectually weak and not very promising. So they came up with some thing they call penta-basis, like 5 elements of the ideology. The 5 elements are patriotism, trust in social institutions, social consent, traditions, and creativity. But I don't know. It just looks like an attempt to sum up some random brainstorms. I think we should wait a little more for when they actually come up with those curricula, if they will, because for now it's unclear what they can propose to the higher education. And just the last thought with which I will want to finish are maybe some policy implications for this. So how these things can be countered, because even though these ideologies are very kind of weak and sterile, it can still be dangerous, especially if the country becomes more and more isolated from the world. If, for example, YouTube gets blocked or something like that. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that there is this conflict between the effects of the sanctions that seek to isolate Russia and the policies that could have been used to counter this school propaganda or propaganda in the higher education. Because what can be done to counter these things is to include the younger Russians more intensively into, or keep them plugged into this global informational, cultural, educational space, so that they have alternative points of view accessible to them, so they can travel and see that the West is not what they see in schools and so on. So, but for now, we see that there's this contradiction between the attempts to isolate Russia and what we can do to counter this propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ivan. I like the national unity, heroism, solidarity, or social cohesion, but no vision of the future as a good kind of summary of what they are trying to build. And now I would like to give the floor to Mikhail, who will bring us to the more doctrinal level of what the state is trying to construct with some specific reference to Alexander Zinoviev. Mikhail, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marlene, and thank you all for having me here. And I need to extend my apology for this weird sound of my voice. I lost my voice on these days, so yeah, you have to tolerate that. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay, as I see it, the regime is mesmerized by the Soviet experience, by the Soviet ideological success. And what they are looking for is exactly the same, a universalistic, coherent ideology with a set up pantheon of great thinkers, great philosophers like Marx, Engels, and Lenin. And the regime has been engaging with several intellectuals of the past, like, for example, with Berdyaev or Danilevsky, or with the Soviet mathematician and political thinker Nikita Moiseev, Solzhenitsyn, but probably the most intensively it's been engaged with Ivan Ilyin, who has been discussed as a possible ideology, the ideologist of Putin, the ideologist of the Kremlin regime. However, there is a problem, there is a catch with Ilyin for obvious reasons, because his biography is tainted so much by his engagement with connections with Nazi Germany, because he was aristocratic, white god, emigre, and even his religiosity is not that much welcome in today's Russia, because as I can see it, the regime is increasingly less interested in the Russian Orthodox Church as the producer and the producer of ideology and producer of legitimacy for the regime. This is one part of the problem. The second part of the problem is that the regime is trying to expand its social basis domestically and internationally, and it is trying to hijack more and more of different kinds of political agenda. It's making forays into previously uncharted territories, like, for example, the left-wing agenda, anti-colonialism, and so on. And you can see it from the recent President Putin's speeches that it's been done with some success and with some definite emphasis. And against this background, the philosopher Alexander Zinoviev looks as a very logical and very well passing figure for this pantheon of the philosopher of the regime. His biography and his philosophy really ticks all necessary boxes for this competition for the regime ideologist. And after I've been researching his thinking, it happened that President Putin mentioned mentioned Alexander Zinoviev on the 24th of October during his Valdai presentation, and it was like a great wow moment for me. Yes, I saw that. I saw it had been coming. So yeah, I think that Zinoviev is becoming really relevant. So let's discuss how, in which senses. As I said, he has a very suitable biography. He comes from very modest background, from the peasant background, from the province, and then he made a pretty spectacular career in academia. He became a philosopher. He became the head of philosophical logic department at the Moscow State. And he was also he participated in the Great Patriotic War. He was captain of military aviation, and he also was plotting against Stalin actually just before the war, and he was apprehended by NKVD, but somehow he escaped prosecution. So his biography is quite mythologized by his contemporary followers, but still he looks like a very the ideal typical Soviet/Russian person for the regime of Putinism, to point at him and say, yeah, this is the epitome, the best example of the best Russian man. Besides, his philosophy, his political philosophy is extremely well suitable for the regime. I think that it resonates on so many conceptual levels that I need to say a couple of words about that. The political philosophy of Zinoviev is right-wing or conservative communitarianism, and as I claim elsewhere, I think that Putinism could be best defined as exactly that. Like if you drill down to the bedrock of what is the political philosophy of the regime, that it would be probably right-wing or conservative communitarianism. If you look at Zinoviev's teaching, he argues that all societies consist of so-called human ant hills, or he called them человейники. So these human hills, they are like semi-biological entities. They completely subordinate individuals, so they shape the individual personality, individual life trajectory, and so on. But also human ant hills have their own stable identity, which doesn't change over time. So Russia, as a distinctive human hill, has not changed its identity over its 1,000 years history. And the Stalinist period is actually the acme of all lifespan of Russia as this human hill. He continues on developing his idea that during the 20th century, all these human hills developed into two systems. The first system is the system which he called Zapadnism or Westernism, and then you have the Soviet system. And the Soviet system is exactly the continuation, the logical continuation of Russian hill. So when you hear sometimes it is still being quoted from Zinoviev, they, meaning the West and dissidents, aimed at communism, but they hit Russia. But in reality, in his later books, he developed a completely different picture. He meant that they aimed at Russia and hit Russia, so no discrepancy in here. He argued further on that since in the 20th century these two systems were developing in an antagonistic way, the West is the bad side, on the wrong side of history, because the Western civilization requires all resources of the whole planet in order to survive. And this is exactly the phrase which Putin quoted in October this year. So the West requires all resources of all nations. It is sucking all other nations wide. It is draining all resources and exploiting all other countries and nations in order to survive. And in this context, his criticism of Westernism resonates very meaningfully with anti-colonial criticism. He argues further on that, I have another nice quotation. The West, he says, the West is the rapist of the world. Yeah, the rapist of the world. And then he develops his ideas, arguing that, well, in principle, it is obvious that the West is winning. Yeah, it is winning. Russia is weak and the West is strong. But then he adduces an interesting metaphor of soldiers surrounded by enemies. So like during the wartime, if soldiers are surrounded by enemies, it makes no sense to continue fighting. But he argues that if you continue fighting, actually, then in the contingencies of war, if you still bravely fight, it opens up a possibility, just very small but tangible possibility for escaping captivity. And in this context, he argues that Russia is exactly like this military detachment surrounded by enemies. Russia has to fight, continue fighting against the West, and he adduces two arguments or two factors of success. The first is to have a good ideology or to have a good strategy, cunning, a well thought out strategy of fighting against the West. And second, boldness, daring attack, counter attack. This is how you can actually gain victory. And I think that in today's context, Zinovьev's ideas, Zinovьev's communitarian philosophy and his philosophy of war have become especially relevant. Actually, you have the whole infrastructure of commemorating Zinovьev's writings. For example, you have approximately 1,000 of different institutions. The Biographical Institute of Zinoviev, the Academy of Zinoviev, the Foundation of Zinoviev, Zinoviev's regular readings, Zinoviev's information portal, and so on. He is also supported by pretty important and quite central parts of mainstream ideology. For example, he is supported by Russia Today. He is supported by Россия сегодня and RIA Novosti. He's been extensively quoted by such stellar intellectuals, well, not intellectuals, ideologists as, for example, Dmitry Kiselev, Dmitry Kulikov, Timofey Sergeytsev, many others. He also, and actually in this year we are celebrating, the Kremlin are celebrating the centenary of his birth, and in this occasion they proposed to rename the Institute of Philosophy of the Russian Academy of Sciences into Institute of Philosophy named after Zinoviev, and they proposed also to construct a huge memorial and multimedia center on the territory of the campus of Moscow State University. So far, this proposal was put down, but who knows how it turns out in the future. You have also the Congress of dedicated to Zinoviev, Philosophical Congress in May this year. And you have hearings in the Civic Chamber of Russia, you have exhibitions in Leninka, you have exhibitions in the State Duma, and so on and so forth. So he is becoming important, and with Putin's mentioning him, just rounding up. So we can probably surmise that he is winning the competition for becoming the future or the next, if not there, but one of the most important intellectuals. And he is definitely influencing regime's understanding of the current situation and the war. But it's also useful to study his ideology, because by doing so, you can understand the future developments and twists of the official ideology. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. Fascinating and so good to hear talking about other people than the usual suspects that are promoted by Western media and that are really not the most relevant. And I think it's giving us also an idea that it's not about identifying one or two doctrinal sources. It's a much complex construction with a lot of bureaucratic legacy from the Soviet regime, mechanism of thinking or of doing or trying to interact with the society. It's very much more about the way the narrative, the arguments are framed than it is about like celebrating Berdyaev, Ilyin, or Zinoviev and so on. So thank you, the three of you, for this great kind of overview. And I think you were very well coordinated in kind of moving from the the broader worldview to the more kind of doctrinal aspect. They have several. We have several questions in the chat, and I invite people to ask more. We can go a little bit over the 15 minutes we have for those of you who can stay with us. One of the broad questions that is coming formulated differently is the question of the articulation between what is shared with the population and what is imposed on the population. So the kind of balance between what is more or less consensual and what is a more repressive imposition over the society. And that's a very difficult question, but that's an important point in the discussion about what is shared by the Russian population of that state narrative and what doesn't resonate. And another question is about elites kind of competition. Each of you were mentioning different institutions that are promoting different aspects. And so the question is that, do they compete? Do they cooperate? Do they, each of them has their own kind of niche or job to do? Or do we see different struggles that are kind of more articulated with the struggle happening inside the elite? So it's two really broad questions, and I know we could be a second seminar just on that, but if you would like to catch some of these elements and answer on these two questions, maybe in the order you presented, Iliya first, then Ivan and Mikhail.
Yeah, so the first thing it need to be said that in fact this let's say ideology doesn't need to be consistent. So you can have any kind of cracks and contradictions in the ideology, and despite all these cracks, this ideology could be functioning well. And that is very true for any sort of, let's say, ideological, totalitarian, conservative, fascist, and so on regimes. And that is very true for Russian regime as well. So, in fact, if we look to this controversial biography of Ivan Ilyin, who was 100% anti-communist and who was very, let's say, very committed to this approach, and how to combine him with those who found in experience of Stalinism kind of organic continuation of the historical Russian state. Of course, there is an exact contradiction, but that's the way how the ideology is functioning. Yeah, and that's why I don't see any problem in fact that this broad ideological course doesn't provide any vision of the future. So in fact, we have the problem with the vision of the future not only in Putin's Russia today. It's a general problem, but somehow the current, let's say, ideology in a very broad sense is still functioning without any, let's say, discourse of the future in liberal democracies as well. Yeah. So the other important thing is about the, let's say, institutional history and institutional praxis of ideology, which is very interesting thing because of course you have some exact, let's say, lobbyists of Zinoviev. And we can indicate that, well, you have the widow of Zinoviev, you have some elements inside the Institute for Philosophy in the Moscow State University who are trying to sell Zinoviev as the main figure. Also, you have, I don't know, Gumilev, for example, and there were recent publications about the influence of Gumilev's ideas and the appearances of some Gumilev's narratives, even in the recent Putin speeches, and so on. And I think that this kind of struggles and contradictions can function well. So there is no any necessary result of this struggles. They can somehow coexist together, even with a different type of contradictions.
Thank you so much, Ilya. Ivan?
Yes, thank you for these questions. So the first one was about shared or imposed ideas. Overall, I would say that what I saw in the texts I analyzed is that there is actually an attempt to represent the desired state of affairs as something kind of eternal, inevitable, and factual. So basically, for example, if we take a look at the national unity as one of the key concepts, this is very much this is something that exists only in some imagination, the desired picture, because we know that there are parts, for example, there are parts of Russia where people say they're in Russia, so they're not even considering themselves as a part of core Russia, like for example in Dagestan. So, and there is the process of nation building in Russia is still kind of ongoing. So obviously national unity can be considered to be something that is shared and that obvious. Then the ideas about self-sacrifice. It's difficult to say if it is that alien to people, or is it kind of forced on them. I would say that it is not that the idea of self-sacrifice is that alien, but it's just depends on the context. And we are not actually seeing, for example, a lot of excitement about the heroes of these emergent heroes of the special military operations. So there is certainly some resistance to this construction of this new pantheon of heroes. That is for sure. This is something imposed, that is rather aggressively imposed. Then the concept of solidarity is also quite problematic. So this is something kind of that is often said about Russian society, that is so kind of about community and solidarity. But this doesn't make it true that it is said. Actually, Russian society is very atomized. You can see that in COVID, we saw no kind of gestures of solidarity to the weaker, to the older people. People were not prepared to wear a mask just to protect the older people, the more vulnerable ones. So social solidarity is also something that is kind of said about the society. This is the image that is imposed on the society. It is not something we can see. Maybe it is something that exists also in the imagination of the society about itself as well, but certainly not something that we can see in practice. What we can see is that a lack of trust to the different sources of information, and in propaganda we see this attempt to say that since you cannot believe anyone, just believe the state. The second part, I'm not that sure, but that this idea that you can't trust anyone, it was either shared or more or less successfully imposed. I think this is something more or less shared. I'm not that sure about that. People conclude from not trusting anything that they will trust the state. I think probably they will not trust the state as well. But this lack of trust in anything is something that is more or less shared. And about different groups, different parts of the elite who promote different approaches. When it comes to the education, actually, it looks like it's more or less more or less coherent group that is concentrated around Sergei Kirilenko and some of his colleagues from Rosatom who are now in charge of these processes. There's probably what we can see in some indirect symptom is that there is some debate going on behind what to do with the higher education program, because they try to bring together experts from the higher school of economics from the Moscow State University and from this kind of minutes of their discussions, we can not direct minutes, but some summaries of their discussions. I can see some cleavages there because I know these two universities, they are very different intellectual schools. So on this level, there can be some tension, but not on the top elite level.
Thank you so much, Ivan. Yeah, good point. Mikhail.
Yeah, my first point, I would like to cautiously, mildly disagree with the idea that Russian mainstream ideology is that omnivorous, that it can accept everything, that this is a very disconnected medley of different ideas and concepts. I think that it's highly unnatural for ideology to be so. Any ideology is striving to become coherent, because the point of ideology is to fix up concepts. And if it does not fix up concept, then it's a bad ideology per definition. And I think that we do underestimate the degree of cohesiveness of Putinism, actually. I know you Marlene, used this metaphor of jazz band, and I like it, but I think I would probably make slightly more, slightly different metaphor, the metaphor of the salad bowl. The salad bowl. So you have like a salad bowl of the salad Caesar, and you can add many ingredients in it, a lot of possible variations, but you cannot put herring in it. Yeah. So some ingredients are just not fitting. The same as Putinism. There are some ingredients which simply do not fit. So I think that there is a certain and quite high actually degree of cohesiveness in it. The second point about the internal differences inside the political and ideological mainstream. So far, I can see two large processes here. The first is that ideology from the fringes, from the red-brown milieu, from right-wing and left-wing radicals is moving quite speedily towards the mainstream, towards the center. And the second is that religion somehow is becoming less relevant. Yeah, that's pretty new and pretty interesting, I think. Maybe it's just fluctuations kind of up and down, but probably it's a long-term trend, and I'm pretty much, curious to know what happens next. Speaking about the most important producers of ideology, I think that many would agree with me that this is perhaps this milieu around SWOP, around this Council for Defense and International Politics, Russia and Global Affairs, Valdai Club. And perhaps the most important, the lodestar of propaganda is Karaganov. Yeah, it really gave me a pause several times when I was reading Karaganov, and then a few weeks or months after that, Putin repeated these articles almost word by word. So I don't know how it actually is happening, but Karaganov has Putin's ear. And the last point about Putinism, top-down and bottom-up kind of processes, it's slightly not my sphere of competence, but I can see that there are three large value groups in Russian society. This is the value group of justice, and actually the demand of justice is the highest, and that is why you can see that the regime is trying to piggyback on this justice agenda. Justice, strong hand, and three, this is human rights. Yeah, the liberal Western values are relatively marginal, and nationalists are also pretty marginal. So these three groups give you two possible configurations. The first configuration is justice plus strong hand, and this is exactly Putinism. So Putinism suits the Russian society very, very well. It's really the demand for Putinism is high. But I think that statistically somewhat higher demand is for a different alternative configuration, justice and human rights, which gives you a traditional, just canonical social democracy of Scandinavia, for example. So if not Putin, then yeah, then it would be a social democracy, perhaps somewhere in the direction of Communist Party of Russian Federation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. I think that was a great way to conclude. The elements you were bringing, I think, are really important about also the way the population is interpreting, right, the messages that are sent to it and how it has its own need. And I think the social justice is indeed a critical one. And you could imagine indeed another trajectory that would arrive after, or that could have arrived before but didn't, that would connect social justice and human rights. So indeed, there is this kind of leftist aspect in the Russian grassroots political culture that I think is important to take into consideration, and that is restraining what the regime is able to do, in fact, when it has to try to be legitimate. So I think it's giving us a lot of new opening new venue for discussion. You also mentioned the role of the religion, and I wanted to say that at the end of January we will be organizing a one-day event on the Russian Orthodox Church today and the role it's playing, and he also will have a lot of great speakers looking at the different aspects of the church influence on the regime and in the society globally. So I wanted to thank the three of you for this really fascinating discussion. It's always difficult to get the scholarly discussion when we are discussing things that are moving so fast, right? And moving sometimes faster than we can study them. But I think you did a great job in trying to catch the moment and also giving us your kind of analytical perspective. So I'm very grateful to you. Thank you for everybody for attending our event, and we hope to see you very soon for some next event discussing Russia and everything happening around. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.